Why is the UK's economy projected to grow slower than almost every other major economy in 2025? Major forecasts paint a bleak picture: 1.2% growth according to the IMF and just 0.8% per KPMG. What's behind this slump, and is there any hope for recovery? Let's break down the key challenges dragging the UK down and the strategies experts are pinning their hopes on. The slump in growth. Why the UK is lagging behind. The UK is facing a tough economic reality. Growth forecasts for 2025 place it near the bottom among major economies, with the International Monetary Fund predicting 1.2% growth and KPMG expecting an even lower 0.8%. These subdued projections come on the back of a bigger slowdown that began in late 2024, reflecting a mix of global and domestic factors. But why is the UK lagging so far behind its peers, and what does it mean for the country's future? A significant part of the issue lies in weaker trade performance, particularly with the European Union. Since leaving the EU, trade volumes have taken a noticeable hit. Exports to the EU, a critical market for British goods, have been disrupted by new customs procedures, regulatory hurdles, and reduced competitiveness. For example, the UK automotive industry, once a leader in Europe, is now grappling with increased costs and supply chain inefficiencies. While global trade itself has faced uncertainty in recent years, the UK appears to be uniquely exposed as it works through the practical fallout of Brexit. This strain is felt acutely by small businesses that lack the resources to navigate the added complexities of post-Brexit trade rules. Adding to the challenge is the tightening of financial conditions worldwide. Inflationary pressures led central banks, including the Bank of England, to implement sharp interest rate hikes through 2023 and 2024. As a result, borrowing costs for businesses and households have risen substantially, curbing investments and consumer spending. This is particularly concerning in the UK, where household debt levels are among the highest in Europe, leaving many families and businesses struggling to keep up with mortgage payments and loans. While other European countries have faced similar pressures, many have more resilient safety nets or faster putting them in a stronger position. Comparatively, Northwestern Europe seems to have navigated recent challenges with more stability. Germany, for instance, has focused on bolstering its industrial supply chains, and countries like the Netherlands have invested heavily in green technology and sustainable infrastructure. These efforts have helped sustain wider economic growth that often outpaces the UK. When looking at the broader picture, the UK appears increasingly isolated, unable to keep pace with these countries that have embraced innovation and stronger regional ties. It's not only about short-term numbers, it highlights a deeper issue of strategic preparedness. Beyond macroeconomic measurements, these trends have clear human consequences. Many UK businesses, particularly in retail and hospitality, report shrinking customer bases as budgets tighten. Families are scaling back on discretionary spending, avoiding holidays, or postponing renovations, and anxiety over future financial stability is rising. For young people seeking opportunities, the options are increasingly limited, especially for those who may have found it easier to build careers abroad before Brexit. Meanwhile, manufacturing hubs like the Midlands are seeing reduced output and fewer job openings, exacerbating regional inequalities. Elsewhere, global economies are dealing with their own trials, but few are as steeped in structural issues as the UK. In the US, fiscal support boosted both consumer confidence and manufacturing recovery, while countries in Asia, particularly South Korea and China, continue to outpace Western nations due to their focus on technological exports. In contrast, the UK remains hampered by slow productivity growth and a labor shortage, leaving little room for quick rebounds. The fact that even mid-sized European economies, such as Ireland and Denmark, now achieve stronger, more sustainable growth highlights the unique difficulties brewing in Britain. What makes this especially worrying is that these challenges aren't just a temporary fluctuation but are tied to long-standing economic weaknesses. Stagnant real wage growth, reduced investment in innovation, and gaps in infrastructure planning have plagued the UK since before the 2008 global financial crisis. Even during periods of global recovery, such as the mid-2010s, the UK failed to match the momentum of its peers. What we're seeing in these projections is a continuation of that underperformance, one that isn't likely to reverse unless major changes are made. Looking further ahead, the medium-term outlook remains bleak. Forecasts suggest that growth will likely stay subdued, never returning to the peaks seen before the 2008 financial crisis. This paints a worrying picture for a generation that might not see a material improvement in living standards. It suggests that the UK could face what some economists call a lost decade of economic stagnation, a term typically reserved for much larger crises, but increasingly fitting for Britain's situation. Even slight recoveries in GDP growth may not be enough to address widening inequality or collapsing public services. But what's clear is that this story goes beyond GDP figures. Economic growth reflects the health of a society, encompassing everything from job opportunities to public investment. The current trends suggest deep-rooted issues that cannot be fixed with short-term efforts. Later, we'll discuss how weak productivity and policy decisions play a central role in this sluggish growth. But these economic numbers make one thing clear: Britain's slump is not just a passing storm, it's a systemic concern. The productivity puzzle, the root of the UK's economic struggles. Since the global financial crisis, productivity has been the UK's most persistent economic thorn. Productivity, or the measure of how efficiently goods and services are produced, isn't just some abstract metric. It's the engine behind economic growth, real wage increases, and the improvement of living standards. But in the UK, this engine has been sputtering for well over a decade, leaving the country struggling to keep up with others like the United States or even smaller European economies. The result is a widening productivity gap that's made life harder for ordinary citizens. What's particularly striking is how this gap between the UK and other nations has grown. While countries like the US have seen steady productivity improvements thanks to investments in technology and innovation, the UK has lagged far behind. Since 2007, productivity growth in the UK has slowed to such an extent that it's now referred to as the productivity puzzle. Meanwhile, living standards have moved in lockstep with this trend, worsening in global rankings. In 2007, the average UK household was about 8% worse off than households in Northwestern Europe. By now, that gap has ballooned to 20%. Incredibly, projections suggest that, in terms of living standards, Slovenian households will overtake the average UK household by 2024, with Polish families potentially doing the same by the end of the decade. This breakdown in productivity has everyday consequences. Real wages, the amount people earn adjusted for inflation, have stagnated for years, meaning many households are no better off financially than they were over a decade ago. For skilled workers, especially younger ones, this lack of upward momentum is causing them to leave the UK altogether, seeking better opportunities abroad. It's not just about higher pay elsewhere, it's about the feeling that something is fundamentally broken at home, with limited opportunity for real career growth. One of the most significant contributors to the problem is chronic underinvestment. Compared to many of its international peers, the UK has consistently spent less on improving its infrastructure, supporting innovation, or even funding critical research and development. Private sector R&D spending in particular is notably low. Businesses often struggle to access the funding needed to expand, modernize, or upskill their workforce. Without this investment, there's no catalyst for the kind of efficiency innovations required to lift productivity to the levels seen in the US or parts of Northwestern Europe. Housing is another area where policy failures have fed into economic sluggishness. The UK has been building significantly fewer homes than its population requires for decades, a situation made worse by restrictive planning laws. The limited availability of housing has driven up prices and rents, leaving both workers and employers to pay the price. High housing costs discourage geographic mobility, preventing people from moving to areas with better jobs. This weakens the labor market's efficiency, particularly in parts of the South where housing pressures are at their most extreme. Unlike other countries that streamline housing construction or prioritize public housing projects, the UK seems caught in a cycle of piecemeal solutions and short-term thinking. The National Health Service, the NHS, is yet another stumbling block when it comes to productivity. Though it receives regular funding increases, inefficiencies within the system prevent it from delivering better outcomes for citizens. With an aging population driving demand for services and spiraling costs for new medical technologies, the increased funding hasn't translated into visible improvements for patients or the economy at large. Health inflation, where costs rise faster than overall economic growth, further compounds the problem. A less healthy workforce contributes to extended periods of illness, reduced output, and a general drag on economic performance. All of this ties back to the structural issues that continue to weigh down productivity, leaving policymakers with an unenviable challenge. On paper, there's hope. Initiatives like the IMF's growth mission aim to target many of these issues, from infrastructure underfunding to barriers in housing and business expansion. But the size and complexity of the reforms required are staggering. The IMF has noted that the success of these efforts hinges on properly sequencing them, starting with smaller reforms that can create momentum before moving on to major structural changes. Even so, the sheer scale of the task is daunting in a time of shrinking fiscal space and global uncertainty. At the heart of the UK's economic struggles lies a fundamental truth. Without fixing its productivity crisis, the country will remain stuck in low growth and stagnant living standards. But addressing this issue is far from straightforward. It requires a willingness to overhaul overregulated industries, incentivize long-term private investment, and rethink policies that inhibit economic dynamism. Even then, progress is likely to be slow, given how deeply entrenched these challenges have become. This raises an important question. Even with ambitious plans like the Growth Mission, can the UK muster the political and financial will to make progress where it's desperately needed? Or will these emerging initiatives be too little, too late to prevent further erosion of living standards? The task of lifting productivity isn't just an economic goal, it's a necessity for securing a better future. But as we look forward, this effort will hinge on much more than individual policies. It will depend on navigating the constraints of monetary and fiscal policy, which complicate reform at almost every step. Navigating uncertainty. Can policy save the UK economy? Policymakers in the UK are stuck in a balancing act, and it's not an easy one. They need to find ways to stabilize the economy in the short term without sacrificing long-term sustainability. It's a tricky equation, soothing immediate economic pain while addressing deeper issues like weak productivity and strained public finances. But in doing so, are they doing enough, or are their efforts simply delaying bigger problems? One major challenge is the tight financial conditions that are casting a shadow over the recovery. Rising interest rates over the last few years have been a blunt but necessary tool to combat inflation. By late 2024, household borrowing costs reached levels not seen in decades, putting pressure on families and businesses alike. People are saving more, worried about future economic shocks, which means spending, a key driver of growth, remains subdued. These rising precautionary savings, as economists call them, make it harder for the economy to pick up pace. Combine that with stagnant wages and elevated living costs, and you have a recipe for prolonged economic sluggishness. Looking ahead, the Bank of England has signaled that monetary easing is on the horizon, with interest rate cuts expected to begin gradually in 2025. KPMG even forecasts 3 rounds of rate cuts during the 2020s year, followed by 2 more in 2026. The thinking is simple. Lower borrowing costs should ease financial pressures on households and businesses, helping to boost spending, investment, and overall economic activity. The IMF has backed this strategy, noting that a gradual and flexible approach is wise given the current uncertainty. Still, it's worth noting that these cuts won't solve everything. Interest rates might drop, but without broader reforms, experts agree that long-term structural issues won't disappear. Monetary policy alone can only do so much. Fiscal policy presents a different set of challenges. The UK government has laid out plans for growth-focused spending while keeping an eye on fiscal sustainability. The IMF called these plans credible and praised the government for balancing growth with the need to pull public finances into line. The strategy includes increasing tax revenue over the medium term, which is expected to support greater public investment while also shrinking deficits. But this balancing act leaves very little room for error. With global economic conditions still uncertain, a misstep, like slower than expected revenue growth or unexpected spending increases, could disrupt these carefully laid plans. At the same time, enormous fiscal challenges loom on the horizon. The UK's aging population is expected to significantly raise public spending in the coming decades, particularly on pensions and healthcare. Based on current policies, by 2050, public spending could increase by about 8% of GDP just to keep up with these demands. That's substantial, And high debt levels combined with expensive borrowing mean the government has limited space to simply take on more debt to cover the costs. As the IMF notes, tough decisions will need to be made about spending priorities and the role of the state. These are politically sensitive questions. Who gets less so? Others can get more. And how much higher can taxes realistically go before they begin to drag even more on the country's growth? Subscribe for more details. The risks extend beyond public balance sheets. Persistent global trade uncertainty continues to weigh heavily on the UK, which now struggles to attract the private investment needed to boost productivity and growth. When companies perceive trade environments as too volatile or business environments as too rigid, they hold back on expanding operations, training workers, or investing in new technologies. The government has positioned itself as pro-growth, but the need to uphold fiscal rules constrains its ability to fully tackle these deeper weaknesses. Investing in innovation, clean energy, and infrastructure are all critical steps to ensure long-term recovery, but they are expensive, and given the limited fiscal headroom, difficult to implement at the scale required. The reality is that policymakers are walking a fine line. Some argue that the government is being overly cautious, especially given the risks of doing too little, too late. A heavy focus on adhering to fiscal rules could mean missed opportunities to enact the significant reforms needed to address weak productivity and regional inequalities. Others might see the current approach as the safest route, considering the tight budgetary environment and potential for further economic shocks. While these policies might provide relief in the short term, they don't necessarily fix the bigger issues. For instance, households might feel a bit of breathing room from lower interest rates, but that doesn't address the high cost of housing or slow wage growth, problems rooted in much larger systemic failures. Similarly, while government investment plans aim to support growth, they are being implemented within a framework of constraint that limits their potential impact. And as trade partnerships remain strained and industries navigate post-Brexit realities, productivity growth, arguably the most critical piece for securing future resilience, remains elusive. Subscribe for more details. Ultimately, while monetary and fiscal policies are tools of stabilization, they are not transformative on their own. What the UK faces is not just a momentary economic blip. These are fundamental challenges to the structure and direction of its economy. Can targeted policies navigate the country through this storm, or are they simply trying to patch leaks on a sinking ship? Whether or not the UK can address its deeper systemic issues will decide more than just economic outcomes. It will reveal whether the country's current challenges are a stepping stone to recovery or a sign that long-term decline has already set in. Conclusion: the UK's economic struggles aren't just a story of low growth or weak productivity. They're rooted in structural challenges that require bold actions across every level of society. Leaders must prioritize systemic reforms, targeting long-term investments in innovation, infrastructure, and regional equality. Businesses need to focus on sustainable strategies that drive productivity while creating meaningful opportunities. And citizens, above all, must demand vision and accountability from policymakers. The road ahead will test resilience, but the UK's future is still unwritten. With bold decisions and collective effort, the country can pivot. But without it, the risk of continued decline grows ever more real. Subscribe for more details.